At night, the house spoke in whispers. The wood creaked, the clock ticked, the wind brushed against the shutters, but none of it sounded like life. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded on her lap, staring at the darkness that wrapped every corner of her small home. Once this same silence had been peace. Now it was a wound that never closed. She could still remember the laughter that used to echo through these rooms, her husband's deep voice calling her name, the soft murmur of the radio as they drank coffee together. But now only memory answered her thoughts. The air felt heavy, almost sacred in its stillness, as if it carried the ghosts of everything she loved. The night stretched long, and sleep would not come. She turned on the bedside lamp, its light dim and golden, and opened her Bible. Her fingers trembled over the pages she had read so many times before, but the words blurred, not because of age, but because of the tears that quietly gathered in her eyes. She closed the book and whispered into the emptiness, "Lord, are you still here?" Her voice broke halfway through, and though no sound came back, she stayed there, listening, hoping, waiting for an answer that the silence refused to give. Morning arrived softly, spilling pale light across the living room floor. Evelyn shuffled in her slippers, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Her eyes, without thinking, drifted toward the old rocking chair by the window, his chair. It sat there exactly as he had left it, a folded blanket on the armrest, a Bible resting on the side table, and a thin layer of dust that no one had dared to disturb. She stared at that chair the way one looks at a photograph, still, silent, sacred. It was the last place he had sat before the sickness took him. Sometimes she could still see him there in the dim light, his glasses low on his nose, his voice humming an old hymn about heaven. The memory was gentle, yet it pierced her like a blade made of tenderness. She thought about cleaning the chair that morning, about putting the blanket away, dusting the Bible, maybe even moving it to the corner, but her hands wouldn't move. Something inside her couldn't bear to touch it, as if doing so would erase what little remained of him. So instead, she just stood there watching the sunlight fall over the empty seat, until the tears blurred it into a soft, glowing shape. Evelyn whispered, "You would have told me to be strong, wouldn't you?" Her voice was small, almost childlike, and though she was alone, the air felt heavy with listening, as if heaven itself paused for a moment, remembering with her. In the quiet of the afternoon, Evelyn opened the drawer of her old writing desk, the one that hadn't been touched in months. Inside lay a small bundle of yellowed envelopes, tied together with a piece of faded blue ribbon. Her fingers trembled as she untied it. The letters were all written in her delicate handwriting, addressed to her husband, but none of them had ever been mailed. The first one began simply, "I made your favorite pie today, but it didn't taste right without you." She smiled through tears as she read her own words, feeling the ache of a love that hadn't faded, only deepened into silence. Each letter carried a different piece of her, hope, anger, longing, confession, all poured out to someone who could no longer answer. There was one near the bottom of the pile that she had never finished. The ink was smudged, the sentence cut in half. "I wish I knew how to keep going." She didn't remember why she stopped writing that day. Maybe because she couldn't find the right words. Or maybe because some part of her still believed he would walk through the door before the ink dried. Evelyn pressed the letters against her chest. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Do you still hear me, love? Do you still know?" The stillness of the room didn't answer, but in that moment the quiet seemed gentler, almost tender, as if the words had found their way beyond the paper. She placed the letters back into the drawer, tied the ribbon once more, and left it slightly open, not as a goodbye, but as a space for one more letter someday. The next morning, the town was wrapped in mist. Evelyn pulled her old coat around her shoulders and stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold air. She walked slowly down the quiet street, her shoes tapping softly against the pavement. It was the same route she used to take with her husband, to the small grocery store on the corner, where everyone used to know their names. Now, no one stopped her. People hurried past with phones in their hands and purpose in their steps. The world seemed too fast for someone who had nowhere to go. She passed by the bakery, where the smell of warm bread used to make him smile. She almost went in, but couldn't. It hurt too much to order just one roll instead of two. At the crosswalk, she paused to let a car go by. Its reflection glided over a shop window, and for a second she caught her own image there. Small, grey, and distant. She barely recognized the woman staring back, not because of age, but because of emptiness. Her eyes no longer held the spark of someone who expected anything from life. When she reached the end of the block, Evelyn stopped and looked at the sky. The clouds were low and quiet, like heavy thoughts hanging above her. She wanted to pray, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could manage was a whisper, "Lord, if you're still walking these streets, please don't pass me by." And though no sound came back, the wind stirred just enough to brush her cheek, like a hand she almost remembered. Sunday morning came with soft light and the distant sound of church bells. Evelyn sat by the window watching neighbours in pressed clothes walk down the hill toward the small white church. She used to go every week, sitting in the third pew from the back, her hands folded around a worn hymnal. But that morning, she couldn't bring herself to move. The house felt safer than the silence she feared she might meet there. She told herself she was just tired, that she'd go next week. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't the distance to the church that stopped her. It was the distance she felt from God. She no longer knew what to say when she bowed her head. The words that once poured out easily now felt heavy and foreign, like a language she had forgotten. She turned off the old radio that played hymns and let the house grow quiet again. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling beside her. She looked at the open Bible on the table and traced the edge of the page, remembering how her husband used to whisper verses to her when she was afraid. Now, even those words felt like echoes from another life. For a long while she just sat there, the bells ringing in the distance, the light shifting across the floor. When the last chime faded, she closed her eyes and said softly, "Maybe you've stopped waiting for me too." The thought hung in the air like a shadow, and yet somewhere deep inside that silence, a faint warmth stirred, a flicker, small but alive, as if heaven still remembered her name. That night, Evelyn knelt beside her bed, as she had done for years. The floorboards were cold against her knees, and her joints ached with every movement. Still, she clasped her hands together, because that's what she'd always done, even when the prayers no longer came easily. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the old heater and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. She began softly, her voice breaking the silence like a fragile thread. "Dear Lord, it's me again." But after that, the words stumbled. Her mind went blank, her throat closed, and all that came next was a sigh, the kind of sigh that carries years of exhaustion, not of the body, but of the soul. She waited, trying to find the right words. Thanksgiving felt distant, praise felt forced, and even asking for help seemed pointless. The longer she stayed there, the heavier the quiet became, pressing against her heart. So she whispered instead, "You already know, don't you? You already know what hurts." A tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the back of her hand. She didn't wipe it away. It was easier to let it fall than to fight it. In that small pool of light from the bedside lamp, she looked almost like a child again. Broken, honest, waiting. Her lips parted once more. "Please," the word barely escaped before her voice gave out. And then there was only silence, not cold, not cruel, just the quiet of a heart that had run out of words and still somehow hoped that God was listening anyway. Days passed like soft grey pages, one folding over another with no change in colour or sound. Evelyn moved through them quietly, her body performing small tasks, washing a cup, folding a blanket, feeding the cat that sometimes visited her porch, but her soul remained still. It wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was the ache of being unseen, the quiet fear that heaven itself had turned its face away. Sometimes she looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror and wondered if even God remembered what she looked like. Her hair had turned white, Her shoulders curved inward, her eyes dimmer than before. People used to say she had a kind smile. Now, she couldn't remember the last time her lips had curved without effort. At night, she sat by the window, watching the stars shimmer faintly through the bare branches of the trees. She used to believe that every one of them was placed by God's hand, that each spark in the sky meant something. But lately, they looked too far away to mean anything at all. The distance between her prayers and the heavens felt immeasurable. One evening, she said out loud to the quiet room, "I think you've forgotten me, Lord." Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, like a truth she had accepted. But the moment the words left her mouth, something inside her broke a little, because even in her doubt, part of her still wanted to be wrong. She leaned her head against the window pane, eyes closed, and in that stillness she whispered one last thought to the stars. "If you're still there, please remember my name." The wind rose softly outside, and for just a second, the silence didn't feel quite as empty. The night came heavier than usual. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and the sound should have been comforting. But to Evelyn, it only deepened the ache. She sat in her chair, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the dim glow of the lamp. Her body ached in familiar ways, but tonight the tiredness went deeper, sinking all the way to her spirit. The day had passed without a single word from anyone. No phone calls, no visitors, no letters. Even the radio had gone silent after she'd turned it off mid-song, unable to bear the cheerful voices. Now there was nothing, only the rain, the lamp, and the weight pressing down on her chest. She thought about her husband again, about the years they had shared and the promises they had whispered. He had always told her, "We'll grow old together, Evie." And they had, until one of them had to keep growing old alone. She felt angry for a moment, not at him, but at the cruel arithmetic of love, how one heart is left to hold the silence for two. Her hands trembled as she reached for her Bible. It was too heavy tonight, so she let it rest on the table and closed her eyes instead. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Lord, I don't have the strength to keep trying." The words hung in the still air. She didn't cry this time. Even her tears were tired. She just sat there, listening to the rain until her breath grew slow and the line between prayer and sleep disappeared. Outside, the storm quieted, and in that fragile hush, something unseen began to draw near. The rain had stopped. The world outside was hushed, as if even the night was holding its breath. Evelyn woke suddenly, unsure if she had been asleep or simply lost inside her thoughts. The lamp still glowed beside her, casting a soft circle of light that trembled over the Bible she hadn't opened. Her heart felt strange, not heavy, not light, just still. She knew this feeling. It was the space between giving up and being held, and for the first time in many months, she didn't try to fight it. She just let the quiet wash over her, like water finally finding its level. Her voice was barely a sound when she spoke. "Jesus, if you can still hear me, I don't know what to ask for anymore." Her eyes closed, and she breathed deeply. "I don't need you to fix anything. I just need you to be here." The words drifted from her lips like the faintest wind. They were not strong, not eloquent, just true. It was a prayer stripped of everything except honesty. A surrender not born of defeat, but of trust. She no longer had the strength to explain. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single tear slipped from her closed eyes, and in that tear was all that was left of her resistance. A lifetime of waiting, aching, hoping, now released into his hands. The silence in the room deepened, but this time it was no longer empty. Something unseen had heard her whisper. Something holy had begun to move. The night was utterly still. No wind, no creak of wood, no sound of rain. Only the slow rhythm of Evelyn's breathing in the quiet room. It was the kind of silence that doesn't frighten, but humbles. The kind that feels alive, waiting for something sacred to unfold. Evelyn sat there with her eyes half closed, not asleep, not awake, simply there. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, palms open, as if she had finally stopped trying to hold on to the pain. There was peace in her exhaustion, a quiet surrender that made space for grace to enter. The lamp flickered once, then again, and for a moment she thought the power might go out, but it didn't. Instead, the air in the room seemed to change. It grew warm, gentle, weightless, as if the walls had faded and she was sitting in a space far wider than her little home. She lifted her head slowly, feeling something she couldn't name, a sense that she was no longer alone. There was no sound, no vision, just a presence, subtle, yet undeniable, like sunlight filtering through unseen clouds. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't dare to speak, afraid that even a word might break whatever this was. And then she knew, without proof, without sight, that heaven had entered her room, and the one she had longed for was nearer than her own breath. It was not a miracle of thunder or light. It was quieter than that. It was the stillness before love made itself known. Evelyn opened her eyes slowly, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The lamp beside her still glowed faintly, but there was another light in the room, a light without a source. It was soft, golden, alive, the kind of light that doesn't just touch surfaces, but touches the soul itself. It shimmered gently, resting over the worn Bible, spilling across the photographs on the wall, and settling over her hands like warmth made visible. She blinked, trying to understand what she was seeing. There were no shadows, no edges, only light that felt like love. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't afraid. In fact, for the first time in years, she felt completely safe. Every lonely night, every unanswered prayer seemed to melt into that glow, as if the light itself was gathering her sorrow, holding it tenderly and whispering, "It's over now," she whispered softly. "Jesus, is that you?" The sound of his name lingered in the air, and though no voice replied, something in her heart answered, a deep knowing that didn't need words. The light pulsed once, not brighter, just nearer, like a heartbeat, like love breathing. Evelyn felt warmth spread through her chest, and the tears came again, but this time they didn't sting. They shimmered in the glow, like pearls returning home to the ocean of his presence. The air around Evelyn had changed. It no longer felt like air at all, but like something sacred, something alive. She could feel it, not with her hands, but with her soul. Every part of her, the brokenness, the weariness, the years of silence, seemed to lean toward that unseen presence sitting quietly beside her. There was no movement, no sound, and yet she knew. Someone was there, not imagined, not hoped for, real. It was the same knowing that had once told her she was loved, the same whisper she had felt on the day she said her wedding vows, the same peace she had prayed for but never thought she'd feel again. The air felt warm near her shoulder, and she sensed as surely as breath that he was sitting beside her. Not distant, not unreachable, but right there, where her loneliness used to sit. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Her spirit recognized him before her eyes could. Her heart slowed, her hands steadied, and a deep stillness filled her chest, the kind that makes you forget every fear you ever had. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't feel small. She didn't feel forgotten or old or invisible. She felt known, completely, utterly known. And though no words were spoken, she understood. He had been there through every empty night, not absent, only waiting for her heart to be quiet enough to feel him. It came softly, like a breath through the heart rather than through the air. At first, Evelyn thought she imagined it, a gentle murmur that seemed to rise from within the silence itself. But then she heard it again, clearer this time, tender and steady, wrapping her name in a love she had never known before. Evelyn. The sound of it undid her. No one had spoken her name that way in years, not with that warmth, not with that care. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room, and somehow it filled her. Every syllable carried memory and mercy together, as if he were reminding her of who she had always been, and whose she still was. She pressed her trembling hand to her chest, and the tears began to fall again, quietly, freely, like rain in spring. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, "Yes, Lord, I'm here." Then came silence again, but not the old aching silence she had known for years. This silence was alive, breathing with peace, and within it she felt the meaning of his call. He had never once forgotten her name. He had spoken it over her life since the beginning, and tonight he had simply reminded her that she was still his. Evelyn closed her eyes and smiled through her tears. To be called by name, that was enough. The room felt drenched in stillness, as though time itself had paused to make space for something eternal. Evelyn sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her breath slow and steady. Then she felt it, not on her skin, but deeper, where pain had lived for too long. A warmth began to spread from her chest, soft and steady, as if a gentle hand had rested there, a hand she could not see, but one that knew exactly where she hurt. The warmth moved through her body, reaching the places where loneliness had settled, where sorrow had taken root. It was not the warmth of the lamp nor of the air, but of love itself, a love so real it made her body tremble. She gasped quietly, her fingers clutching the blanket near her knees. But instead of fear, a strange calmness took her, like being held after a lifetime of falling. Her heart felt lighter with each breath, as if something heavy was being lifted away. Grief, regret, the quiet guilt of surviving when others had gone. They all loosened one by one, until what remained was only peace. And though she still could not see him, Evelyn knew. Jesus was there, not standing before her, but within her sorrow, touching the deepest wound of her life and turning it into rest. For the first time since she'd become a widow, she felt whole. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it had been touched by love, and love had stayed. Evelyn's tears came again, but they were no longer heavy or bitter. They flowed softly, without effort, as if her soul was finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. Each drop felt like a release, a small baptism of grace. She didn't wipe them away this time. She let them fall because now she understood that even tears could be holy. The presence beside her didn't fade. It stayed, quiet, patient, unhurried, like someone keeping watch through the long night. The warmth inside her deepened, and with it came a peace that didn't ask for understanding. It simply was, a peace that felt alive, breathing in rhythm with her heart. She leaned back against the chair, eyes closed, and whispered through her tears, "I can feel you. Thank you." Her voice trembled, not from sadness, but from wonder, as if her heart couldn't contain the gentleness of what was happening. The years of silence, the prayers that had faded mid-sentence, the aching question, "Have you forgotten me?" all were answered now, not in words, but in the hush of love that wrapped around her like light. Her tears slowed, and a small smile found its way to her lips. Not a smile for the world to see, but the quiet smile of someone who has finally been found. And when the last tear fell, it carried no sorrow at all. Only peace, pure and still, settling into every corner of her heart. The night deepened, but the room glowed softly, not with the light of the lamp, but with something that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Evelyn sat still, afraid to move, not out of fear but out of awe. She had prayed for comfort. What she had found instead was heaven, quietly resting inside her small, worn living room. Every shadow looked softer, every object, the chair, the Bible, the photographs, seemed wrapped in peace. The air carried no weight, no sadness, only calm. Even the old clock on the wall, always marking time, seemed to slow its ticking, as if time itself had bowed in reverence to what filled that space. Evelyn breathed deeply, and with every breath she felt something holy settle deeper inside her, a knowing that she was not waiting for eternity someday, but sitting in its presence now. The boundaries between her little home and heaven had blurred. It was as though the two had met, and in that meeting she was healed. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The questions that once tormented her had lost their urgency. The why, the when, the how long, all had fallen silent, as if love itself had answered them simply by staying. And in that quiet glow, Evelyn realized that heaven was not far away. It had always been this close, waiting for her to open the door of her weary heart. When morning came, the world outside seemed new, not brighter, not louder, just different. The light through the curtains carried a softness she hadn't noticed before, as if it had borrowed a piece of the glow that filled her room the night before. Evelyn woke slowly, her body still aching with age, but her heart felt young. The heaviness that had lived in her chest for so long was gone, lifted by hands she hadn't seen and replaced with something still and beautiful. She moved quietly through the house, her steps lighter, her mind unhurried. Even the sound of the kettle boiling in the kitchen seemed gentler, like a familiar melody she'd forgotten she loved. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, where the old rocking chair waited in its usual place. For a moment, she just watched the morning unfold, the dew on the grass, a bird pecking at the feeder, a faint mist rising over the fields. It all looked the same, yet she knew nothing was the same anymore. The night before had changed everything. Her hand rested over her heart as she whispered, "You're still here, aren't you?" And though no sound came, the warmth returned, soft and sure, the same peace that had filled the room now filling the daylight. She smiled quietly, and for the first time in years, the day didn't feel like something to survive, it felt like a gift to live. That afternoon, the house was filled with sunlight. Evelyn sat at her small desk by the window, a blank sheet of paper before her, and the pen she had once used to write all those unsent letters to her husband. But this time was different. Her heart felt steady, her thoughts clear, and her words, for once, had direction. She began to write slowly, each stroke of ink deliberate, each line flowing from a place she had never written from before. Peace. "Dear Jesus," she began, "I don't know why you chose last night, but I know you came. I felt you here, not in a dream, not in a sound, but in a way I'll never forget." Her hand trembled slightly as she continued. "You didn't take away my loneliness. You turned it into something holy. You didn't answer every question. You became the answer." Tears welled up again, but they were gentle now, falling silently onto the edge of the page. "Thank you for remembering me when I thought I was lost, for calling my name when I had forgotten how to pray, for sitting with me until my heart remembered peace." She paused and smiled faintly. "If you ever wonder, Lord, yes, I still miss him, but tonight I know he's with you, and you are with me, and somehow that is enough." Evelyn folded the letter and placed it inside her Bible, between the pages of the Psalms. She didn't seal it. She didn't need to. The one she wrote to had already read every word before the ink dried. A few days later, Evelyn walked to the little market on Main Street. The same walk that once felt endless now seemed lighter, as if the air itself carried her steps. She wore her old blue scarf, the one her husband had given her one Christmas long ago, and though her hands still trembled as she held her bag, her face looked different. There was a softness around her eyes, a quiet light that hadn't been there in years. Mrs. Carter from the bakery noticed her first. She smiled in surprise. "Well, Evelyn, look at you. I haven't seen that smile in so long." Evelyn returned the smile, small but genuine, and for a second the years of loneliness between them seemed to dissolve. The man at the register greeted her kindly, and when she answered, her voice didn't sound weary anymore. It carried warmth, the sound of someone who had remembered how to live. Even the children playing outside stopped for a moment and waved to her. She waved back, laughing quietly at their joy. As she walked home, she realized the world hadn't changed at all. The same houses, the same trees, the same rhythm of ordinary life. But she had changed. The emptiness that once echoed inside her was gone. In its place was a still joy, not loud, not fleeting, just steady, like light through stained glass. When she reached her porch, Evelyn paused to look at the sky. The clouds drifted gently and she whispered to herself, "I see you in all of this now." Then she smiled again, not because life was easier, but because love had stayed. Evenings became her favorite time. The golden hour light spilled softly across her living room. touching the chair by the window, the open Bible on the table, and the photograph of her husband that now seemed to smile back at her. Evelyn sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, watching the shadows stretch and fade as the day folded itself into night. There was no ache in the silence anymore. It had become something sacred, a place where she met Jesus in the stillness, where her soul could breathe without fear. Sometimes she would whisper his name just to feel the warmth that followed. It was always there, like sunlight that lingers even after the sun has gone down. She knew now that peace wasn't something that came and went. It was someone, the same presence that had filled her room that night, the same voice that had called her name. Her heart no longer searched for signs. She had found what she needed. Not answers, not change, but the quiet assurance that love had not left her, and never would. As the last light of day touched her face, Evelyn closed her eyes and smiled. The world outside kept turning, but inside there was only stillness, the kind of stillness that feels like home. And in that hush, where her story had once been filled with sorrow, there was only peace now, pure, steady, eternal, the peace that never left.